Well, thank you for being here, everyone. You say it's so gracious of me to come out here. Thank you for the invitation, but it is also great to escape Michigan winter for a few days. So I jumped at the opportunity to do that. Today I'm going to be presenting on an intersectional approach to accessible computing, and I'll get into what exactly that means. But first, I want to lead with this premise, right, that human-computer interaction really aims to center humans in computing-related decisions and design, etc. But this isn't always the case. So then I phrase this question of what happens when we do not do this. Our intentions are that we are doing so in ways that are meaningful, that supports communities and helps communities, etc. But that is not always the case. So I want to just share a few examples that have popped up over the last, 5 or so years. One is around gender bias. This is a screenshot from an article on Amazon where researchers revealed that Amazon's hiring tool exhibited gender bias, where it was biased against resumes and applications that contained the word women's in any case, whether it was a particular women's university or organizations that someone was part of. It negatively ranked people with the word women's in their resume. So they found this out and they fixed it, right? We also see instances of bias based on race and ethnicity. There's a tweet on the left that shows how a Black man was tagged using an image recognition system solely with terms related to race and ethnicity, instead of other tags when he had used other images of white men, which would say things like doctor or parents or handsome. And then on the right is a screenshot from a New York Times article showing how popular smart speakers were essentially misidentifying words from Black people more so than white people, right? And so this is Black and white. There are many other layers in between, but this is really showing how there's not only gender bias, but there's race-related bias as well. And then there are these big implications for this type of bias based on race or gender, such as in healthcare or in mortgage algorithms, and there are tons of others examples of this in this one book that I really like. If you have not yet read it, I'd highly encourage it. It's Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, which really highlights tons of examples in how bias is exhibited in systems at a scalable level. And so these examples that I've just presented primarily focus on race or gender, but identity is multifaceted, right? So this is an image of Oprah Winfrey. She is not just female and not just Black, but the intersection of both of them. And so this screenshot shows how this image of Oprah is incorrectly identified as male with a fairly strong confidence metric here, 76% certain that Oprah Winfrey is male, which is very wrong, 100% wrong, right? And there are similar biases with other examples of people with these intersectional identities, such as Michelle Obama when she was younger, and she's predicted to be a young man wearing a Black shirt with fairly high confidence, both of which are very wrong. And then there is even confidence levels, even higher confidence levels, that she is wearing a hairpiece, and that's actually her hair, right? And so these systems not only misclassify Oprah and Michelle Obama, but they also completely fail to acknowledge these different intersectional identities of someone is not just male, female, but also can be female and etc. Right, and so this is what this term intersectionality really emphasizes. It was made popular by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it discusses the unique experiences of Black women and how they are different from the experiences of just being a woman or just being Black. And so I have a description of intersectionality from a paper led by Sheena Arate that describes intersectionality at this higher level as emphasizing the importance of understanding the combination of one's identities instead of a singular identity, particularly with historically minoritized identities that are discriminated against and kind of don't benefit from the privilege in ways that these majority groups do. And then often discuss, I have some circles on the side here, often discuss our identities like race and gender and ethnicity when we think about intersectionality. But in today's talk, I'm going to be arguing for extending discussions about intersectional identities to disability and older age as they relate to accessibility more broadly, because that is my particular research area. I really focus on older adults and, at least at the moment, blind and low vision communities and how they can best be supported in computing systems broadly defined. So the central question guiding today's presentation is how can human-computer interaction as a field use an intersectional approach to designing for disability? And so I'm going to use two related studies to basically answer this first sub-question of why an intersectional approach is important, and then end with a study that demonstrates how an intersectional lens really affects design. So first, why is an intersectional approach important? I'm going to discuss this in the context of disability intersecting with older age. Right, so when I discuss disability and age, I want to highlight that disability is not synonymous with aging, but it is highly correlated with aging. So these statistics up here are showing that 15% of the world has one or more disabilities, where when you look at those who are over the age of 60, that number significantly increases to 46% of people have more than one disability. And then similarly with chronic conditions, where 1 in 4 adults have at least 2 chronic conditions. And then when you look at older adults, more than half have 3 or more conditions, and so chronic conditions. So this is why I say that disability and older age, they don't equate to one another, but they are correlated. Similarly, disability affects internet access. It really complicates access to a lot of computing systems that rely on the internet. So I have a chart up here that is enlarged and redesigned, essentially from a paper by Dobransky and Hargitay, where they provide evidence of what they call this digital disability divide. And so they conducted a survey with people who identify as disabled and those who do not, and they find that 80% of the respondents without disabilities use the internet, whereas only 47.8% of those with disabilities use the internet. And then of those numbers, of those who use the internet, broadly speaking, those who had broadband internet access in their homes, 77% were people without disabilities, and then for people with disabilities, it was only about 66%. So they're seeing, and both of these numbers were statistically significant, so you're seeing that disability does affect internet access, but also older age affects internet access, and these numbers are a little older at the moment, but in the most recent version of this report from Pew Research, they show that internet use and broadband internet access in one's home drops significantly when someone is over the age of 75, and even more significantly with those who are over the age of 80. And so both disability and age affect internet access when they're studied separately. And so you can only imagine at the intersection of these two, the same problem exists. So in the first part of this presentation, I'm going to focus again on the intersection of these two identities, disability and older age, specifically vision loss, so blind and low vision communities, because vision loss is very prevalent among the older adult population. And up here I have a statistic showing describing age-related macular degeneration, which is one type of health condition that leads to late life vision loss. And so one report states that there were 11 million older adults in the United States with age-related macular degeneration, and this number is only expected to grow. I think this report said that it was expected to double within the next 30 years, and this was a report from 2016, which is not that far away now that we are in 2023. Okay, and so, you might be thinking, well, there are tons of technologies that can support blind and low vision people, blind and low vision older adults in accessing the internet, and that is correct, right? There are assistive technologies like screen readers or even screen magnifiers that can support technology access with vision loss. But in my prior work with blind and low vision older adults, I learned that that was a little bit more complicated than what I was expecting it to be. So we interviewed blind and low vision older adults, and many of them were interested in engaging online, but learning to use these assistive technologies became super overwhelming. They're like, I do not want to learn how to use a screen reader. This has 100 different keyboard shortcuts. I'm never going to remember all of them. And so it became so overwhelming that those older adults who were active online before vision loss often became inactive after the onset of vision loss, experiencing vision loss or blindness. So yes, there are some technologies that exist, but they don't necessarily solve, quote unquote, these issues of access to different online communities, information online, et cetera. So to support this desire for accessible online engagement, I worked with a group of students to build an interactive voice response, or IVR, community called Express. And so if you're less familiar with this term IVR, it's essentially something that people can interact with through keypad or voice input, often on some type of phone device. You can think of IVR systems. Unfortunately, I'm going to lead with the negative version. These customer service phone trees that are so annoying, where it's like, press 1 to do this, press 2 to do that. That's the annoying version. But there is a better version of that. So we built this Express system kind of mimicking that in a sense. But it's more of a blogging community that's accessible to anyone that has a phone that can dial a number. So this doesn't have to be a smartphone. It could be a landline phone. It could be a non-smartphone. And so I just want to briefly give a bit more detail about this system. So I did say it was inspired by these customer service trees, but at a higher level, it's actually more so inspired by a lot of work from researchers in the Global South who find that these interactive voice response communities are super helpful for those who either don't have internet access or face some type of challenge with internet access. And so across a 2-year period, I had done a series of formative observations and interviews, prototype testing with older adults in a particular long-term care community right outside of Northwestern in Chicago. And it showed how they were seeking engagement, right? They wanted to engage with others online, but they hated accessing a computer, like going to this computer room, figuring out how to turn on the computer and log in. And then the password resets were a whole other story where you had to reset the password for one email address and then reset the password to the backup email address and the backup. So they were like, we don't want to deal with this at all. We would much rather interact by phone, by speaking on a phone. And then we did some interviews with older adult bloggers who were really describing how meaningful blogging was on a computer. They were describing how meaningful it was as a practice in late life. And so that's why we decided to kind of merge this idea of interacting by phone with some type of blogging community as a meaningful kind of engagement practice. So we published the findings of the formative work in a T-Access paper and a Chi paper, so you can get more of the details if you're interested in it. But I just wanted to start by briefly walking through how Express works, because you say blogging on a landline phone, and people are often very confused by that, and understandably so. So first, when someone dials in, we use Twilio, which is essentially this voice cloud application tool. And Twilio routes users to this Python script that then checks a MySQL database to essentially pull the profile information of the number that's coming in, the person who's dialing in, to authenticate them to the correct account. So no one needs to use a password at all, which is one of the biggest barriers that we observed from observations in this particular long-term care community. And so they're authenticated based on the number that they dial in from. This script then reads out loud a main menu using text-to-speech and voice XML, and users could do one of three things. So it's not this long, complicated customer service phone tree. They could do one of three things. If they press 1, they can listen to others' posts and comments. If they press 2, they can listen to their own posts and comments. And then if they press 3, they can record a new post. And so they're interacting here, and I put up here the image of the keypad. They're interacting here through keypad input as opposed to voice input, because of research which shows if someone is completely unfamiliar with the system and you tell them to kind of use voice input to navigate, they're not going to be sure of how to navigate through that system. So we use keypad input to give them very specific options of what they could do. So they interact through keypad input. If they want to listen to others' posts or their own posts, they then hear a recording of that exact post and also comments. They hear the exact recording. And then if they want to create a post, they record the message by speaking directly into the phone receiver. They press a digit to signal the end of the post. And then they could either hear that post replayed and decide that they want to re-record, or hear the post replayed and decide, I'm good with this, publish this to the system. So after they publish the post, the address of the audio recording is then stored in the database to be retrieved anytime someone wants to listen to a post, and the same with the comment. And then it's also made available to other Express users. And so the benefits of this are that older adults do not need to purchase an additional device or learn how to use a completely unfamiliar system, because it was very similar to not only customer service phone trees, but also voicemail, which I personally no longer check, but someone still checks their voicemail. And so they're really familiar with this type of metaphor. And so overall, Express is enabling us to study new forms of online interaction amongst blind and low vision older adults. So before I move to what we did with Express, how people used it, are there any questions about how it works? Anything I can clarify? Yes.
Are there any things about security? So I'm very familiar with phone, we can look at the information, but typically I have to give some type of word, birth date, something to ensure that the person who's calling is actually me and not someone who has my phone.
That's a good question. We did not implement any security mechanisms here, other than the fact that we asked them what phone number they would be dialing in from. And Twilio essentially can pull the phone number of the person who's dialing, and we use that to authenticate them to the account. But there are lots of questions. There are options to then give people a particular PIN number. They choose a 2-digit number or 4-digit number when they dial in to kind of double authenticate them into that account. But we didn't do that in this case. Yeah, good question. Yes.
How is the user able to navigate through all the information, listening to other people's posts? How are they able to navigate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't say what all of these other numbers did. So there's the high-level navigation of listen to others, listen to own, and create a new post. And then when they go into listening, let's just say listening to others' posts, there are ways that they can skip around in the system. So I think 4 was replay the post, 6 was skip to the next post. And so that way they could kind of traverse through the system. The posts were also similar to a blog, were presented reverse chronologically. So the newest one was always presented first, and then they could go backwards from there. Did that answer the question?
Sorry, one more. And then if they want to like save a blog post or I don't know, go back, is there a way to do that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There was no saving in this version. We were trying to strip blogging down to its basic fundamentals. We had initially had in some other, like 7, 8, and 9 were some other numbers as well. 0 was always back to the main menu. But then when we presented it to older adults, it was very confusing. So we just removed those additional features. And there were instances where for comments, we would use double numbers to represent the same thing that you could do with posts. Like 4 would replay a comment, 6 would replay the post or or skip to the next comment, very similar to a post. And we found that that was okay, but once we started to reuse numbers for other things, that's when things got confusing, because there is a little bit of more of a cognitive burden of listening to content in an online community than looking at it visually. So that's why we kind of removed a lot of the additional features that you might find on a traditional blogging platform. And I feel like there was another question. Yes.
When users try to create a new post, how easy is that process? Because I suspect that the recording from audio to text may not work very well, as there are still kind of technology limitations. What's the quality of that process, and how easy it is for users to create a new post, make edits, etc.?
So that's a great question, because that's one of the reasons why we use the exact recording to play back the person's post. So if they want to create a new post, they record directly into the phone receiver, and then that's the exact recording that is then played anytime someone else wants to listen to that post. It's never converted into text. And so part of that was the speech to text recognition wasn't the greatest at the time, and still not always the greatest. But also people really liked when we prototyped this system, people really liked the emotion that they can hear from someone else's voice through a direct recording, as opposed to having more of the synthetic speech. Like they could get to know whether someone was being sarcastic or not. And so that's why we kept just the straight recording. Did that answer your question? Okay. Great. All great questions. Okay, so we then deployed Express to blind and low vision older adults, and we wanted to understand how they used this voice community, what afforded meaning in voice communities, what was meaningful, and then what benefits the voice communities like Express provide. So we worked with several students, and 2 of which are pictured here, Sam Ankenbauer and Pujo Padie, to lead 2 field deployments with Express. So the first was more of a pilot that was with 7 blind and low vision older adults. They all had acquired vision loss, and this was over a 10-week period. And then the second was a much longer study that was funded through the Retirement Research Foundation, and it was a 1-year field deployment with 43 blind and low vision older adults, about half of which were assigned to this intervention condition where they used Express, and about half were assigned to this control group where they did not use Express at all. And so for both groups, those who used Express and those who didn't, in this 1-year deployment, we did collect a few things at the 1 month, 6 month, and 12 month period. Specifically, we measured loneliness and social support. So while not significant, these measures around loneliness and social support, and I'll explain a little bit about why in a few, we did notice some trends. So one is that loneliness decreased for everyone in the study, but this was more pronounced for those who used Express, for those who were in the intervention condition, meaning that this difference between 1 month, the first month, and the 12th month was larger for those who used Express. And then we saw similar trends with social support, where you might have to kind of flip things in your mind here. A lower social support score here actually means higher social support, right? So overall, people felt like they had more social support if they used Express compared to those who did not. And so we note that these are trends and not statistically significant because we did this study in the pandemic, in the height of things, right? So everyone was less lonely at the end, and everyone felt more socially supported at the end. So people had different social distancing requirements depending on what state they were dialing in from. So it was a little bit messy to see any statistical significance changes there. But we did see some improvements, some trends. We want to do this at a larger scale. We were seeing some more significant trends in the first 6 months, especially related to loneliness. And so we were kind of thinking, well, maybe these types of voice communities are better for people when they're more extremely isolated, because this was May of 2020 is when the first person was enrolled. And so they were enrolled between May and November of 2020, and then a year from that they ended. So we're thinking when people are more extremely isolated, maybe these voice communities could provide support. But beyond the survey data, what was most interesting were these qualitative findings related to disability. So first, blogging by phone using Express provided opportunities for meeting new people and connecting on a deeper level, which participants described was difficult to do elsewhere. So there's a quote from one participant who said, if I'm walking on the street, you would say, hi, can I help you? That was all you would do. You wouldn't say, hi, how are you? What can I do for you? And so for him, there's always this stigma of having a quote unquote visible disability, because he used a white cane to navigate around barriers in his environment. And so people always assumed that he needed help when he was out navigating somewhere, instead of, just trying to start a conversation without that assistance component within it. So by using the phone to blog, he could more easily talk to people about different topics, and participants really valued this type of depth of conversation and connection. Participants also described how blogging by phone was a safe space to work through disability. So they talked about topics like finding accessible voting booths, or many really rallied around this one person who described recently having some vision changes and no longer being able to drive due to his vision loss. So because of the amount that this was a 7-person pilot and people really valued the topics in the system, I said, oh, okay, well, what if we were to increase the number of people who were using this system? We had already done a study where I'd interviewed older adults who were blogging, cited older adult bloggers who were already very involved with blogging. And so I asked the participants in this study, the blind and low vision older adults, you all seem to be wanting some more content in this system. Do you mind if I invite sighted older adult bloggers? And initially, everyone was on board with that. All 7 participants said, that would be great to hear from other people. They're also older, like maybe we can learn from them, or maybe they can learn from us, etc. But after the blind and low vision older adults actually heard the content from the sighted older adults, they definitely changed their minds. And so one person said, I can get that anywhere. I don't need to have a certain site that's just for the visually challenged, to have everybody else in there. So they actually did not, after hearing the content, they did not want sighted older adults to be on this system at all, because they hear the experiences, they call them the majority, they hear the experiences of the majority daily, and they really valued this being a system that was specifically for blind and low vision older adults. Now they said, well, maybe they could listen, but they shouldn't be able to contribute. Maybe they could listen and learn about disability, but we don't want to hear what they have to say. Particularly, I remember some of these posts where some of the sighted bloggers were talking about how beautiful of a day it was and how the colors were shining, and it's like, that's not what they want to hear in this community. So these data points helped us to understand the boundaries on community participation, and also highlighted the importance of designing for intersecting disability experiences. And so what I mean by that, it's more so like, just because someone is an older adult, it doesn't mean that their experiences are the same as a blind and low vision older adult. And similarly, if someone is younger and has some type of vision impairment, that does not mean that their experiences are going to be the same as someone who is older with a vision impairment. So these concepts around intersectionality, intersectional critical theory, have really typically been discussed in the context of race, class, or gender studies, describing, again, this importance of the intersection of two or more oppressed groups. And here, I'm using this intersectional lens to really discuss the intersection of age and disability. So kind of returning back to this original question of why it is important to use an intersectional approach, but really here we're seeing that it can really impact the value that someone places on a community, where participants really valued the community when it was only blind and low vision older adults, and they didn't want to really use it once sighted people started to come and quote unquote infiltrate the system, right? So can impact the value that someone places on community. Now, in the last part of this talk, I wanted to briefly use some recent work to discuss how an intersectional approach might affect design. But before this, it's kind of a separate-ish topic, although it's connected by intersectionality. Were there any questions on the previous study with Express? Yes.
Were there any requirements for users of like how many posts they have to be making sure that they posted, or was it all organic?
It was all organic. We did, after their initial pre-interview, we said, hey, like, try it out. Let us know if you have any questions. We recommend trying to listen to one post and create one post and comment on one post. But after that, we didn't have any requirements for use because we didn't want to force them to use something. Another question?
Yeah, what kind of phones? Are they using like smartphones or just the old school physical phones?
Yeah, most were using landline phones. Because we did do some in-home visits during the first interview, at least for the pilot study. We know that most were using landline phones. For the second study that was in May of 2020, we weren't exactly sure what types of phones they were using. But from the pilot, we did learn that they preferred landline phones with raised buttons so that they could tell which button they were pressing instead of having to use a screen reader and kind of swipe through to figure out what button they were pressing on a touch screen. So yeah, most were using landline, at least in the pilot. And I imagine if it wasn't landline for the full deployment, a lot were also using cell phones with raised buttons, so more like feature or non-smart phones.
Is it possible for users to kind of like, I guess, like form groups within, well, like while using the application, where it's just like, whether it's a specific topic, they're able to kind of like all focus in versus the inflow of topics?
Right, so instead of presenting the topics kind of, or the post reverse chronological order, could they find different topics? Not in this version, no. And so that was something that people said that they wanted, and we were trying to figure out a way to do this without reusing too many buttons on the phone, or like ways to do that through speech might be another way moving forward. And it did seem like people were forming their own kind of mini groups where they would always go back and listen to the same people's posts and comment on the same people's posts, but not in a formal, it wasn't formally structured that way. Yes?
I'm curious if you got the sort of common online community dynamics of like, I don't know, influencers, lurkers, that kind of stuff? Or was it in any way transmogrified by the context here?
We did, and I'm wondering if I have a backup slide, but yes, we did see that there were, especially in the 1 year long deployment, we were able to see those patterns a bit more, where there were people who were, we called them top listeners, and there were people who were top posters, and often they did not intersect. Like there was a whole group of people who was listening, and then there were sometimes called lurking, and then there was a whole group of people who were always contributing the content. So we did see kind of those similar contribution patterns there. And our next step is to, actually, I'm supposed to be working on this in the next month or so, writing a paper where we like provide more detail about the narratives of how listeners and posters use the system, because they use it in different ways. Often it mimicked their interactions on screen-based online communities where people would say like, oh, I'm a lurker on Facebook, and I also am a lurker here. They didn't actually use those words, but essentially it did mimic their behavior in other communities. Mm-hmm. All right, so next, again, we're gonna get into how can HCI use an intersectional approach to design, and specifically how might intersectionality affect design itself. And so this is a study that focuses on the intersection of disability and ethnicity. This work was led by Ph.D. student Rahaf Al-Harbi at University of Michigan as part of a team with Sharita Schonebeck. And this next project focuses on visual description or visual assistance services like Microsoft's Seeing AI, which is very helpful for describing visual content to blind and low vision people. So we have a few examples here of this particular app is useful for describing short text, details about people, about products or cans, about currency, what are these different bills, etc. But it's also helpful in describing content, private content like social security cards, right? But the tricky part is what happens when someone uses these visual description applications to either intentionally or unintentionally take a photo of sensitive or private content. So take this obviously very fake social security card on the screen. There are lots of privacy implications with sensitive content like social security cards, or even credit card numbers, or bank application, or bank routing numbers, etc. And so while not currently an option, a lot of privacy researchers and accessibility researchers are advocating for obfuscation or intentionally hiding content or blurring content for privacy reasons. But then there are these other questions that arise from that, like, is obfuscation always the right approach? Or what type of obfuscation? Is it blurring out a specific part of an image, or is it blurring out the background and only leaving a certain part? And then also, how can we better incorporate feedback? A lot of this discussion around obfuscation is really driven by privacy researchers. How can we actually include and incorporate feedback from the blind and low vision community? So then we did a study, and the two primary questions for this study, guiding this study, are one, when is obfuscation useful for blind and low vision people? And then two, what are the barriers to these obfuscation approaches? And so just for the purposes of time, I'm going to focus on this second research question, to barriers to obfuscation approaches. And so for this study, Rahaf started by recruiting on social media and through the National Federation of the Blind. And from this very intentional recruitment process, we learned specific challenges that blind and low vision people at the intersection of different ethnicities, of different ages, of different genders, of different other disabilities anticipated facing with obfuscation. So one of these challenges is related to the social security number example. One is, well, what if people don't want sensitive content hidden? Like, what if they're filling out a form and they actually need to hear social security number information, or they need to hear credit card information read out loud? So one participant, Clara, pseudonym, provided another example when she said, I don't know my bank number off the top of my head, but I might want it to be read out loud to me, right? So there are instances where obfuscation is actually not something that should happen, or at least not obfuscation in the sense that the number itself is always hidden. Maybe everything around it is hidden, and then the number is shown. In another context, David said, you're following some navigation and it senses something in the environment that it deems as inappropriate and blurs it out. But all of a sudden, an agent can't see a street sign or something because it's actively being occluded. That's definitely going to be a dangerous problem. So more so in a navigation context, if you're walking and actually you need to see certain details about your environment or need to hear them described in order to get from point A to point B safely. So, one solution to this you might be thinking is you can ask people each time they use the system whether they want sensitive content to be hidden, like social security numbers or bank accounts or street sign names. But we are arguing in this work that this is then placing a lot of burden on the disabled user, a lot of labor, and it's kind of on one hand, and then also it's kind of difficult to know what is deemed quote unquote sensitive, right? That can differ for context to context, culture to culture, day to day, person to person. And so Saad illustrates this dilemma of deciding what is sensitive or private when he said in the Middle East, there are more concerned about their families, especially towards females and stuff. On the other hand, in the US, for example, medication is a big deal. So people in the US consider medication a very private thing, whereas in the Middle East, it is not a big deal. So this work, or this particular quote, is extending prior work on privacy-preserving mechanisms amongst Muslim American women, and it's showing that it may be difficult to have an automated approach relying on this quote-unquote universal set of private items, and it's suggesting that blind and low vision people are aware that the data that powers these systems are biased usually towards Western countries and Western contexts. So what would it mean to more strongly consider disability identities, intersecting disabilities that intersect with ethnicity or other cultures as well when designing systems, informing how data is collected, how data is stored, how data is presented, and kind of just doing data work more broadly. So again, to return to this question of how might an intersectional approach affect design, well, it might inform us of the biases that we have in our systems. In this case, image-related data, privacy-related data, favoring more Western societies, Western disability perspectives, and really highlighting these challenges that exist at this intersection of disability and ethnicity. And so our next steps are to work with blind and low vision people more in a co-design sense to really understand more about how we can do this in a more meaningful way. How can we create obfuscation experiences? How can we be more transparent in what is going on within these systems in ways that are meaningful to them and that could support approaches like obfuscation? But at a higher level, these questions also connect to how to best represent intersecting identities within a data context. So I've worked with some folks here in the audience today, Michael and June, to show how current data sets don't do well at even representing one identity, right? And identity facet, in this case being age and older age specifically. But then there are open questions about how can data better represent multiple identities, particularly beyond race, ethnicity, and gender, like these three that are the focus. What about one disability? What about two disabilities? What about older age? What about any other thing outside of race and gender? How can we do that in a more kind of sensitive way and in a more nuanced way? So with that, I'd like to thank my many collaborators, students, and funding sources, and kind of use this as we have about 15-ish minutes left to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you. questions.
Someone jump in and I'll hand you the mic.
Thank you. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on universality versus pluralism. Some of us actually taking a course with Michael have just been talking about some of these things. And especially as it relates to intersectionality, the trade-offs between thinking of a universal design like a ramp on a curb that works for everyone versus something that's really specially designed for a specific community. That's a pretty broad question, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so that's a great question around this concept of whether universality is the right approach, when is it versus isn't. And what we're seeing is that everything, especially in the HCI community, if you ask a question, the answer is usually going to be, it depends, right? And so there are questions, more so questions around how can we best use information, data about people that can help them to make the best decision in different contexts, right? So the context might be, all right, I am on a street and I am trying to navigate and it is cloudy or something, right? So these more contextual approaches, I think, are more so where we are leaning so that it can be flexible and things can change as opposed to having a universal thing. But then that also means having enough information, not only about the context itself, but about the user. And right now we don't have enough information about the user to then be able to merge context plus user to inform the best decision. So yeah, great question. Yes.
Great talk.
This is not working.
It doesn't
It's for the
amplify.
recording. Yeah, it's not.
It's for recording.
Yeah.
Okay. So great talk. I really enjoyed. For the first part, I wonder which user group specifically XPRIZE is going to help the most, especially in terms of loneliness or social support. My suspicion is that if someone has a very strong real-world social network or social support system, they may not benefit a lot from this type of system versus if they don't have like strong real-world support, then maybe this type of technology would work well. I wonder whether there are any insights from the studies.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think we were a little bit limited by a few things to be able to detect any differences there. One was how we recruited participants. So we partnered with the National Federation of the Blind for recruitment. And for that, we actually got a lot of participants from the New Jersey National Federation of the Blind chapter for some reason. But they're already connected. Some of the participants were already connected to these NFB communities. And so it was hard to know, like, is it that people are already connected or not? There were a couple of people who in their pre-interviews, we asked these questions of, you know, are you connected to any other communities? How do you engage with other people? How do you engage with other blind people, older adults? And there were a couple who were in rural environments. One person was in such a rural environment that she was saying, yeah, we don't have Uber or Lyft out here to go to the grocery store. I have to hire a driver, and this has been my permanent driver for the last 5 years, et cetera. So we definitely saw that there were some differences between those who were dialing into NFB chapters or were even like a president of an NFB chapter compared to those who were like more in a rural context. And that's more so why we're trying to present more these qualitative narratives of how people use the system, just because we didn't have enough participants. So there were 43 total, and I think there was like 21 in one group and 22 in the other group. Let's say 21 was the intervention group who used XPRIZE. Out of that 21, I would say about 10 were active enough for us to be able to look at their pre and post survey data. And so we just really, scale-wise, we couldn't really detect like it was because this person was more connected and this one was less connected, but that's definitely something to consider. So one was how connected were they before the study started? And then there were also questions of how connected were they during the study, which we got from some of the 6-month, and even for those in the intervention condition, we contacted them every 3 months of like, how are things changing, where you are. Some were like out and about as soon as they could get out and about, and others were not, based on social distancing requirements in their area, or even how they could get out. So there were also questions about how social distancing might have affected how social they were with other people during the duration of this study. But yes, that all of those will impact the use that they get out of this system. There was another version of, it wasn't Express, but it kind of led to Express. It was called Vmail, which is essentially Express, but for checking email. And for those who use assistive technologies and who had computers in their home, they weren't really dialing into Vmail because they already had existing mechanisms to be able to do that. And so you would think that that could also transfer to the Express community, where if they already have these social environments, maybe they're using it less, or maybe they're not deriving as much benefit from it as maybe someone who's a bit more socially isolated is.
So I'm curious to get your advice. One reaction to the challenges of intersectional design is that you just turn it all the way up to 11 and go all the way to like mass customization. Like they're like, everyone should be able to very easily personalize for their own, for their own issues and their own use. That is a particular like a design angle we might offer. The other would be to think through a design process that's still creating sort of groups of some sort. They're intersectional groups, but designing, sort of by sampling around these different intersectional identity groups and doing it that way. I'm curious, in the systems and designs that you're envisioning in the future, how should we as designers be thinking about that kind of process? Should we be starting from a point of, okay, how do we actually, on the assumption that the intersectional identities are going to cause this mass proliferation of different contexts, different needs, should we just start from the assumption that everyone's going to be different? Or should we, in our design process, be starting by identifying, again, cells in the matrix, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really a big question right now in like the facts community and the fairness space, and how do we measure fairness if different groups have different definitions of what fairness means, and we can't segment too much because then we can't get any meaningful data. I think I'm coming at, two things. I'm coming at it more from a lens of understanding intersectional identities in terms of understanding how people are using these systems, right? Understanding these narratives of use, of not solely saying, oh, older adults did this one thing and younger adults did this one thing, but there might be a little bit more nuance to unpack there. So really even looking at these groups and saying, are there other things that we might be missing because we're only focusing on one identity instead of, Black younger adults are thinking this versus Black older adults are thinking that. So more so of a lens for interpreting how people are using the system in more of a qualitative approach. But then also part of this is, you can't really separate people into, I don't think we're there yet in terms of being even able to separate people into these different smaller buckets, because we don't have enough data about those smaller buckets, right? We might have a couple of things, and like race and gender, maybe age, and sometimes that's a good thing, right? Because it preserves privacy of individuals who are using these systems. But on the other hand, we're limited in being able to say, all right, now we're going to pull people from this group and bucket them together. I think being able to have that flexibility would be nice. I don't think we'd have to segment to every possible type of combination of someone's identities, but we could say, okay, from this qualitative data, we're seeing that Black older adults are distinctly different from other users in the system. All right, now I'm going to pull data just from Black older adults. So I don't think we have to segment it into every possible option, but more so using the qualitative data to then inform how we're looking at things more quantitatively. But we're a little bit limited on how we can do that right now.
And to pull that thread, what advice would you have to, say, like students in like a intro to design, intro to HCI style course, where they're going to go out and they need to go, do need finding, observation, and their N is not that big.
Right.
Right? Is this about tying the observations we see to broader narratives around intersectional identities, or are there other things how can they be sensitive to these issues?
I think one big thing, and I'm actually coaching students through this in a class right now. Well, not right now, but this semester. In terms of a lot of research, so this class that I'm teaching is a project-based class of accessibility where students work on projects related to disability and older age, and they go through the full like research and design life cycle. And I start the class off with a lot of research in the accessibility space focuses on primarily white women. And so you have to be very intentional about like including people in even these class projects and these smaller scale projects that are outside of what is very convenient to recruit. So I think part of it is just like in these smaller scale projects, being sure that you have different identities represented. It's probably not going to be every identity that's possible or identity combination that's possible, but there shouldn't be like only one type of identity that you are engaging to understand how people interact with systems and products, et cetera. And so that's more so of, I think at the lower level for these like smaller projects is probably what I would recommend. I think then once you transition to, say, a student who's interning somewhere or a student who is has graduated and then goes off to work at companies where they then have access to much larger sample sizes or populations or vendors, et cetera, that then you could use those same principles of not just recruiting one type of person, but do so at a larger scale and then be able to draw out some of these qualitative narratives of use.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really loved like how Express maintains a lot of cultural context for blind and low vision people. Kind of talking about the second part of your talk, I was interested in like thinking about the impact of Express on people who might speak English as a second language, just like different cultural backgrounds. I'm wondering if you like noticed any insights around that, or what your vision is of the potential impact of Express on those communities, just because there must be like a ton of nuance in terms of like English as a second language and verbal input, different levels of comfort. So.
That's a really, yeah, that's an amazing question. In this particular study, just because the like the scales of loneliness and social support that we were using were all in English. We did have like, are you comfortable with English? We didn't have it as your first language, but are you comfortable with speaking in English to participate in this study as kind of a criteria for eligibility? But there are lots of questions, particularly within research in the Global South, the people who might not be literate, preferring to use these voice-related voice communities and voice systems, IVR systems. But then you also get into questions around language there as well, because sometimes the language isn't written, and so voice is like the best way to interact. So I think voice has affordances for people of different cultures and different languages, has its strengths. What we haven't done yet is think about how, and this is just an idea that I'm throwing out here, how people of different, people who speak different languages could be in a voice community together. And so it might go back to, well, maybe we do have some type of way for the speech to be translated to text, and then that text could be whatever language the user primarily speaks, and so that they can interact with people across languages. Like that could be an option, but that's not something that we have considered so far.
I think we're about at time, so why don't we thank our speaker.